Can everybody hear me? Is it coming through? Loud and clear. It needs to be what? Can you hear me? Right, okay. Happy New Year to everybody. Seems a long time ago now, and we're still saying it, doesn't it? But okay, item 1, apologies have been received from Councillor Peter Robinson and Robin Garrido. Is there any other apologies? Lynn Holland. Okay, thank you. Okay, any others? No? I've got another announcement. I would like to welcome Councillor Peter Davis to the meeting. He's under Valerie today. Where is he? Excuse the expression, but you know what I mean. His sign, I think, says Valerie on it, but he is going to change his name for next time. Oh, you're blank? Right. Right, okay. So, I'd like to welcome him to the meeting, and he's going to take Valerie's seats, which are on the Capital Projects and Policy, and as a substitute member to the Buzz Network. Okay? Item 2, declarations of interest. If anybody's got any declarations, please fill in the form and hand it in to Nicola or Sylvia. Thank you very much. Item 3, minutes of last meeting. Can we approve those, please? Is there any matters arising on those minutes? No? Okay, we'll sort that out. Thank you very much. Item 4, 4A, Buzz Network and Subcommittee. Can we move those, please? Okay. 4B, Capital Projects. Can we move those, please? Okay. 4C, Metrolink and Rail Networks. Can we move those, please? Okay. Has anybody got any matters arising on those? Stephen?
Thank you, Chair. Happy New Year. Just want to just make sure we can have a discussion, if possible, please, regarding the recent thefts on the Metrolink telly machines, the ticket machines, please.
We'll get that on the Metrolink agenda, no problem at all. John?
Thank you, Chair, and Happy New Year. Just a comment about Metrolink service performance. There have been some concerns raised about difficulty of fans getting away from Old Trafford. I know in recent months they've been desperate to get away from Old Trafford. Maybe not quite so desperate now, but there is some concerns about Metrolink, people struggling to get away from games on the Metrolink. And I did put in a request that we have a report about not just about football crowds, but generally big events and management of big events on Metrolink performance. And I just wondered whether at some point we could have a report about performance on big events.
Bob will come in back on this.
We'll certainly bring something back on events, but with specifics of Old Trafford. Put in context, we move on the night somewhere in the region of 8,000 fans via Metrolink. We have 110 trams operating. It's the highest output we ever do on any day or any evening. So there is nothing more we can squeeze out of Metrolink at the moment. You've also got to bear in mind that the heavy rail station at Old Trafford is closed, and that can move up to 2,000 additional fans. But the bulk are still travelling by private car, and we're trying to move them away from that. We're working with the club to try and get the station reopened.
Can I just mention, because I actually go to all the home games at Old Trafford. So
notice he's only admitted to it now. Yeah.
So what I meant was, I agree with what Bob's just said about Metrolink, because it's about, but right outside Old Trafford, there are also at least a dozen stagecoach buses going into Manchester City Centre, and lots of fans, because they can literally be at the buses within about 2 minutes of leaving the match. There's an awful lot of fans using those buses, and they're very helpful, and very, you know, most fans are pleased that they're there.
Yeah, thank you. John?
Yeah, I'm not trying to be critical of Metrolink here at all, and I think on certain match days it works okay, and then at other times it doesn't. It's more about some of the decisions about double trams going into certain directions, and double trams not specifically going to East Didsbury, actually. And I just think we ought to see a report that specifically looks at performance, not just about football matches, but big events going on in Manchester.
Okay. Doreen?
We have had reports, Councillor Leach, that when we've had big events at Heaton Park and footballs and things like that, I'm going back 2 years, we were leaving people and it was a mess, and people used to complain all the time. But then they set up this new system where the rail, bus and Metrolink all meet the heads, and it's worked really successfully for the last 18 months. I mean, I will put a report on, that's what you want, but I'm just saying it's a lot better now than it was.
Okay, I've got Steve.
Thank you, Chair. Just briefly on that one as well. I mean, obviously, I live in Stretford. Mike does as well, and I think match days are a big issue, regardless of whether you're a supporter or not. They actually do have a massive impact, and there's something like on a match day, something like 77,000 people there, and obviously in all sort of modes they need to get to and from the ground. We do actually have planning around the events, and I think that you may be aware over the recent periods, the Young Boys one, that there was actually a tremendous amount of work gone into things like that. I agree, it's not just about football matches, there are pop concerts and to a lesser degree cricket matches and so forth, but I think there is a lot of, I've no problem with discussing big events across Greater Manchester as a whole, but I think the planning that goes, I'm certainly seeing some of the planning that goes around some of the Man United matches, and I think it is very, very high level, you know, so I think there's nothing to say that there cannot be improvements, but I certainly don't want to give the impression here that there are actually things wrong with it. It's a huge, when you're getting 70-odd thousand people at an event, and it's in a very short period, getting to and from, it's very difficult to do it. And I know that all the different ages, not just Metrolink, but the buses and everything, I'm actually working very hard to try and move people around. And I agree more people should be going on public transport to a degree. As someone who lives very close to A56, and it is a real big problem on match days. And they're not all going to London, as one of the people might suggest in that sense of it. But it is a big event, and I think we do need to do further work on that. And I think United are key to that. And I think one of the things I have suggested previously, and I think I may have said it here in the mid-90s, was that there are some grounds, I think, around London, who actually include public transport costs in a season ticket, which I think I've had mentioned this in the past, and United weren't very keen to take that up. But I think, again, I've said locally that we should actually maybe encourage United to actually do that, because if we can get them to actually take up that as part of the season ticket and actually use public transport, that would have a massive impact, actually reduction on the traffic events on the roads, but it also mean that we can actually do more planning that would encourage people. So that's one of the suggestions I have forward to actually help with it. Thank you, Chair.
I'll take Mike and then I'll bring Bob in.
Just very quickly, I mean, my frustration here is that we're missing the big picture. Actually, transport isn't as good as it should be in Greater Manchester, and the 2040 plan, it should just strengthen there's a few things in there that would help United. There's the White City Station that's in there. There's also the Oxford Road corridor would be a huge boost to United, because you can't get enough trains to stop at Trafford Park, which is a station that serves United, but actually there's no Sunday service, so Sunday matches, no possibility of using that at all. So let's go for the 2040 and actually deliver a public transport system that Greater Manchester can be proud of, and that will serve United as well.
Which will we'll mention shortly. Bob?
Thanks for the feedback there. It's worth noting that for those of the blue persuasion, that City have had in recent years an add-on. Season ticket holders can pay an additional sum so they can use Metrolink on the day, and we're now introducing that for United as well.
Okay, good feedback. Any others? No? Okay, thank you very much. Moving on to item 5, clean plan update. Got Simon, want to take this?
Thank you, Chair. Members are aware that we have been leading work as TfGM on behalf of the 10 local authorities to prepare a clean air plan for around 18 months now. And the work follows government guidance that was set out in the summer of 2017 for a number of places to work to address, in particular, the reduction of nitrogen dioxide levels to meet statutory limits. The last stage of the work was at the end of October last year when we published the final nitrogen dioxide footprint for Greater Manchester, and all of that information is available on the Clean Air GM website. Since then, we have now been working further to develop the measures that are required to address that problem within the fastest possible time as required by government guidance. What we've also done through that period is to set out a series of requirements of government working with Greater Manchester in order to make sure that the right national policy framework is in place alongside our plan to ensure that we can meet that outcome. Those asks of government are set out in paragraph 4.7 of the report and include further work that we want to do with government around the consideration of scrappage schemes, further work with government to ensure that government does have sufficient resources set aside to support the delivery of clean air plans, and also further work to ensure that we have clarity in terms of what government will ultimately ask of Highways England in terms of management of emissions on the motorway network. With that in place, the work that we have been doing, given the scale of the footprint that we face in Greater Manchester, has started to demonstrate that we may need to include the deployment of some clean air zone penalty payment regimes, again as set out in government guidance. Having done that work and having started to reach that level of preliminary conclusion, what we are now proposing to the Combined Authority is that before we finish the work and bring forward a proposed draft clean air plan, that we now need to undertake a further piece of work to properly understand the socio-economic impact in Greater Manchester of the introduction of any penalty regimes. Clearly, we are mindful of the fact that over recent years in particular, communities across Greater Manchester and elsewhere have been encouraged through other policies to take up diesel vehicles in particular, which now pose a significant nitrogen dioxide problem. And we want to understand more fully the extent to which any regimes could potentially inhibit the movement of communities across Greater Manchester before we bring our final proposals forward. So the report here sets out the additional work that we're undertaking in that regard. It also informs the Combined Authority that we have engaged in correspondence with government to make them aware that that means that we will be submitting a plan a little later into the spring in 2019 rather than at the end of January as was originally proposed. So I envisage over the next couple of months that work coming to a conclusion and me then being able to bring to the committee here, Chair, the outlines of the final plan that we then propose to take through individual local authorities. I'm happy to take any questions.
Okay, a moment, I've got John.
Thanks, Chair. We had a briefing on this in Stockport, and present was our Director of Public Health, who is an extremely good officer. And I asked her a couple of questions at the end of this meeting about the relative impact on public health of the area within the narrow compass of government, which is NO2 basically, and asked her questions about particulates in particular. And one of the things which I think in the way in which our awareness of this public health issue is developing is that it's relatively recent that particulates were on the radar at all. They started at PM10. We're now finding that in public health judgment, PM2.5 is more worrisome because the particulates are smaller and get further in. And I put to her the idea that evolution of our knowledge is at a resting point whereby if we don't collect data on smaller particulates, which are going to get further into the lungs of young people with narrower passageways and who travel around in buggies by the roadside when their older siblings are trotting off to school and things like that, that actually we need to do more thorough research on that area. It helps to point out that the government's approach to this issue, and the report's very good on this respect, is very deficient in only targeting transport, within transport excluding the bits that the government itself are actually responsible for, and only targeting one cause of bad air. And in the meantime, we're basically trying to attract the attention here of the leaders of the combined authority. A holistic approach to this issue would actually reflect on non-transport as much as transport, because in the background people are installing wood-burning stoves left, right and centre, undoing the massively creative work done several decades ago now to produce clean air in Manchester and the greater conurbation, which has been a massive lifesaver. So to actually walk away from that, when we debate this for the attention of the public, we need to make sure that they understand that our focus should be on the wider public health issues that underlie this whole movement, and that we don't just simply restrict ourselves on a tick box basis to ensure that we hit government targets which are defective.
Okay, well said. Okay.
I think we're all pleased to hear that there's going to be some socio-economic impact work done. I think that's the biggest question that comes up whenever we talk about any potential charging in clean air zones. Can I, on that though, can I just ask whether you envisage including small businesses in that socio-economic impact report? My particular concern is the impact on small business who rely on running one or two vehicles that may be unfairly penalised if we do opt for clean air charging zones.
Do you want to just come back on that?
Certainly. So yes, the very simple answer is yes. We do want to understand the impact on small business community. What we've also started to do as well is to pick up a dialogue with Federation of Small Businesses, and we are looking to broaden that out now across the small business community over the coming weeks, so that we're not just relying on the evidence of consultants, but we're also engaging directly with businesses as well.
Okay, I've got James.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I'd certainly endorse the concerns of Councillor Butler regarding small businesses with a small number of vans, basically. I think that obviously what we don't want to do is punish small businesses with limited ability to sort of adapt to any new scheme. With regards to sort of the process so far, now at scrutiny committee, which I can't recall, Mr. Chairman, you were at the one chaired by Councillor O'Brien, we were outlined the 4 details. and there were a lot of questions along these lines, and it was sort of more indicated that the scheme might end up more like option A or B rather than option C or D at that. Then, obviously, the Mayor made some comments the other day. On Tuesday night, we were briefed by two of the senior officers at Wigan Council, Rebecca Heron and Paul Barton. I've no doubt you've had similar conversations yourself. Effectively, it seems that any sort of direction we were moving towards choosing one of the options has sort of gone back to the drawing board. So that's certainly the phrase that was used by Paul Barton with us, and that basically none of these four options have been taken off the table, and there doesn't seem to be a favoured one at the moment, certainly as what we were told on Tuesday night. But I do want to ask, though, as far as TfGM are concerned, is there a favoured option out of A, B, C or D, or are we still way off choosing one of those yet?
So I think that's probably the first important point to make. What we are doing is we are managing a piece of work on behalf of the 10 local authorities. It isn't the job of TfGM to take any decisions whatsoever here. The decision-making lies with the individual authorities. There is an analysis that we have undertaken, which we're continuing to refine at the moment in terms of the impact that different combinations of measures have on addressing the nitrogen dioxide problem itself. What we are now looking to do is to turn that into a multivariant policy analysis that considers not only pollution impact but also local economic impact and impact on social inclusion as well. Until we've done that work, we as TfGM managing the work have no particular view in terms of a preferred solution, and it's appropriate that we hold that position until all of the work's been completed.
Okay, John?
Thank you, Chair. There's a similar report going to Combined Authority Scrutiny this afternoon, but it's not the report's not identical, and it refers in the report to the scrutiny this afternoon about funding, and you made the comments at the beginning about funding will come from government to support the fastest route to tackling the NO2 problem. Is there any concern that whatever plan we come up with is actually not going to be perceived as the fastest route to reducing NO2? Because there are some fairly radical proposals that could be put forward that would clearly reduce NO2 levels much faster than what would be considered to be politically acceptable. So is there any concern that we might not actually get the funding because it won't be perceived as the fastest route to tackling the problem? That was the first question. Second question, just carry on from what Councillor Taylor said at the beginning. I certainly support the comments made by Councillor Taylor. The challenge, of course, at the moment is that we're tackling NO2 because we face significant fines for not tackling NO2. Is there a danger that somewhere in the not too distant future we're going to go down the route where there is going to be fines for not tackling particulate emissions as well? And is there, by not tackling that at the same time, is there a danger that it will end up costing us more and us having to do more? And would it be more sensible to actually be trying to tackle the particulate issue at the same time as the NO2 issue? Just a point of clarification, if I can, on page 3, on 1.2, it refers to, it uses the phrase, and may reduce life expectancy. I thought we'd actually decided that pollution definitely did reduce life expectancy. Is it still not 100% guaranteed, because certainly all the evidence that I've read suggests that pollution is killing 49,000 people every year. That's the stat that is often mentioned. So surely it's been proved that pollution is reducing life expectancy rather than may reducing life expectancy, but I might be wrong on that. And then just in terms of the timescale, you said that you're hoping to bring a report later this spring. When do we need a report? What's the final date that a report can come? And is it going to be coming before the May elections, or is it likely to be after the May elections? And then my final point is, on 4.7, the actions that the Mayor thinks that the government needs to take. Is there an expectation that technological changes can actually tackle the NO2 problem, or is behavioural change, and I'm not talking about going out and replacing an old diesel with a more compliant vehicle, can we actually achieve NO2 reduction levels without serious behavioural change in terms of modal shift from car onto other forms of transport?
Do you want to come back on that?
Firstly, in terms of the risks around if there were a package more directly focused on the principal impact, the government's own guidance makes clear a recognition that local authorities have other duties alongside these duties, and that therefore there's a degree of appropriateness in terms of considering those other duties, local economic well-being in particular. So there's a recognition of that within the guidance. What we have looked to do is to keep the government team whose job it is to work with us on the preparation of these plans closely involved throughout the work, so that they understand all of the issues that we're looking at as the work's undertaken, and our expectation is that by doing that we manage against any such risk. In terms of particular issues, I mean, the points that Councillor Taylor made before are absolutely right. There's a growing body of evidence around issues associated with particulates. I probably ought to stress at this point that TfGM has not taken on the clean air duty for 10 local authorities. So what we are doing here is undertaking a project specified in order to address a particular challenge, which is nitrogen dioxide. But what we are looking to do is to make sure that wherever possible, with what is still an emerging science, we are designing a plan that also offers benefits in terms of addressing particulates in Greater Manchester, which kind of leads on to the next point around the reference to nitrogen dioxide. That nitrogen dioxide may reduce life expectancy, as is the case with all environmental science and the impact of environmental science. There are schools of thought in terms of this, but there is a growing body of evidence, and the majority body of evidence, that suggests that there is a direct causal link between excess nitrogen dioxide and impact on life expectancy. But of course it is appropriate that we use the right language that collectively directors of public health advise us to use. In terms of a final date, well, that's a dialogue that's underway now between ourselves and government officials. We are not the only place that has been through this process so far, and as they have worked through that process, work with government to adjust individual deadlines whilst still working to an end focus. So we still work to an end focus, that there is a plan that has been submitted, reviewed with government, and now has a final form by the end of the calendar year. What we're reviewing with government is what the appropriate milestones are through the process to get to that. And finally, with regard to technology changes, because of the nature of what has been asked of local authorities here. So for us to address this problem at the earliest opportunity, and the government has set a guideline timescale of 2021 for that. Within that time window to 2021, technological change alone will not deliver a reduction in nitrogen dioxide levels below the thresholds in Greater Manchester. And that's the reason why we're saying that at the moment, it looks like we will have to propose some form of adoption of the broader behavioural change toolkit if we're going to meet the requirements of the guidance that we've been given.
Okay, Guy?
Yeah, while I would support the aspiration to mitigate the effects on business and people who, for economic reasons, are marginal car owners, I think we mustn't lose sight of the fact that the prime focus is public health and has to be public health. And I'm minded of the life chances of the people, for example, in southeast Bolton and northeast Salford, who suffer some of the worst air conditions in the conurbation and indeed in the country, and have very, very low levels of car ownership.
Okay, Phil?
Thanks, Chair. Simon, how will you manage to deal with the operators such as buses, coaches and taxi operators, given the fact that they pollute the city centres now? What procedures have been put in place, and who will managing the operators?
So, as we've set out in the report, buses and coaches are one of the vehicle types that we're looking at in particular through the process that's been set out. So we are modelling the impact of those vehicle types over time. We have, of course, the committee and TfGM have, of course, been working with the bus industry for a number of years, and we've already secured funding in a number of cases to start to address the emissions of buses. What the work suggests is that we will now need to accelerate that, and so what we've also now started to do is to pick up a particular focused dialogue and way of working with the bus industry, so that we can bring forward a plan that the bus industry understands and can work with us and DFT to introduce as quickly as possible. Taxis is again absolutely critical, and there's a fresh round of engagement that we're now kicking off with the private hire and taxi trade, so that we can properly understand, in the same way that Councillor Butler raised before in the context of small businesses, so that we can properly understand the operational issues that are presented for taxi and private hire operators, and we can build that into the plan.
Okay, I've got 4 more people that have registered. So I've got Steve.
Thank you, Chair. Just to concentrate again, especially on the public health side. A few years ago, I was diagnosed with asthma myself. I live very close to the A56, just a few yards away, really. So I think that's probably no coincidence in that sense of it. And I mean, as you do go around the town centres, I think I've especially noticed it whenever I come into Manchester city centre. I can always taste it much more. You can taste the diesel and so forth. So no matter whether it's a car, a bus, a taxi, there are actually many aspects of it. And I think it is a big problem. We do know that recently there was that young girl in London died just in the last year or so on that one, and that's obviously started quite a debate in that sense of it. And indeed across Greater Manchester we've seen public health advertised across the media the number of people that are suffering. It might not be as many that are dying, but it is actually having a big effect on public health. So nitrogen dioxide is a really big issue. I think it's odd that after all these years, it's only just starting to get the attention in recent times in that sense of it. And I think it's obviously something that does need tackling now, much so. And I think it's actually how we go about it. I think one of the contradictions actually about this whole thing is about the motorways. Obviously, it's a sort of duality, really, because in one sense, we want people to use motorways to actually leave our town centres free of traffic and pollutions. But on the other hand, they're actually a source of the pollution themselves, nitrogen dioxide. Indeed, obviously, where we are, particularly along Chester Road and towards the Trafford Centre, biggest culprits along there, which obviously all related to the M60. It is actually, in one case, there's actually some confusion in the modelling as to whether the pollution that's coming off in terms of nitrogen dioxide, which they originally thought was the local roads, could well be the motorway itself, which runs very, very close to it. So I think it is a problem for it there. Obviously, knowing the report and the work that's been done, it's actually all being modelled up, and we're having big discussions with government about this. But it's obviously, I look forward to actually seeing the government's solution and answers to this, because it is actually a very difficult and very interesting one in that sense. The other aspect, I think, whilst it won't form part of it, something certainly I'm looking at locally, is particularly like idling engines, which is a big factor on this. It's one thing, obviously, having all sorts of vehicles, but I think there's nothing worse than actually, you see all the taxi ranks leaving the engines running. It's not unique to taxi ranks. You see some buses leaving it, you see car drivers doing it, HGVs, particularly. So, I mean, it is idling engines that I think that is another contributing factor. I know it's obviously nothing that we can do about this in sense here, but it's one of the things that I think local authorities can tackle themselves, and I'm starting to look at this in Trafford to a degree. It's going to be, I'm not going to say we're going to get it done overnight and stuff like this, but it's something I think each local authority actually does need to take on board and actually help with this bigger problem. So thank you, Chair, and I'm not expecting solutions to that. I know it's part of the work that's going on.
Thanks for your comments. I've got Angelica, Annette and Noel, and then Zidra, and then I'm going to move on. So, Annette, Angelica first.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, thanks for bringing this report now. It is important, and there's healthy debates on the impact of clean air and what Greater Manchester is planning to do. So it's important that it is discussed before the combined authority meeting tomorrow. I do agree that with all of the comments actually that have been made, and that pollution penalties have got a role to play in this. And I'm very pleased that we are looking at the social as well as the economic impacts of the penalty options, as well as their effectiveness in terms of reaching compliance. I've got two questions to ask at the same time. We need to get the residents on our side and raise their awareness in terms of both the scale as well as the impacts of the problem. And I know that you have launched, Greater Manchester, TfGM has launched a campaign for that in November. Manchester has a campaign as well. Our campaign has been sort of doing very well and is carrying on. I know that we were conflicting with Christmas messages and people's attention was diverted, but I would be interested in finding out how is the campaign performing, and also what are the plans for the campaign in the future. Secondly, are you considering the changing goalposts in terms of future-proofing what is going to be proposed? I read an article that in 3 European cities now have got the power to ban Euro 6 cars from city centres after the European Court of Justice has ruled against the relaxation of European limits on levels of emissions. And I wonder, how is that taken into account, and is that on your radar in terms of reaching compliance? Because what we don't want is to say that Euro 6 cars are okay, but then in 2 years' time, then we need to change it. And when we are considering a scrappage scheme, what are we telling people to purchase? Thank you.
Okay, I'll take Annette.
Thank you, Chair. Well, first of all, yes, I echo many statements, particularly Councillor Taylor's statements about the particulates. I really can relate to all the work done reducing pollution in the 50s and 60s. It's been lost in a way, so that's well said. I'd just like to ask particularly about the motorways. This is 512 on page 11. You refer to you working with a government team in terms of developing this, what your options are and what the information you have to hand. So are you not working, what response are you getting from Highways England? Could you explain more about what you're saying in that paragraph, please?
Do you want to take those two,
Certainly.
Simon? And then...
In reporting back in the future, as I suggested, I'll bring some data to the table on the performance of the information campaign so far, and certainly we're working very closely with the heads of communication, Kate and her team, working very closely with heads of communication across the 10 local authorities to continue to improve the information that we put out there through the information campaign, and also to think about what's the appropriate form of communication for the next stage when we do get to that stage. And again, we'll make sure that we brief members very clearly. And we're also, and it's incredibly welcome, getting an awful lot of support from Councillor Sawyer and the other 9 lead executive members across Greater Manchester in helping us to think through that activity. So that's incredibly helpful. The point is very well made that the science continues to move on in this regard. The way in which we do that is to continue to work very closely with the government officials who will be our immediate arbiters in terms of this, and to make sure that there isn't any activity that's taking place in the consideration around other UK cities that we're not taking into consideration here in Greater Manchester. With regard to motorways, yes, we've been working very closely with Highways, and I coordinate a group where lead directors from each of the 10 local authorities come together to work on the preparation of the Clean Air Plan. Within that group, we also involve Public Health England and also Highways England. So we have clarity in terms of what are a relatively small range of measures at the moment that Highways England are working on in terms of the motorway network. But what we're aware of is that Highways England have not been directed by government in the same way that the local authorities have to specifically deal with a given set of exceedances. And so that's why we're also having the dialogue with government, because that's actually an issue ultimately for government to determine on, not Highways England themselves.
Okay, I've got the last 2, Noel first and then Zikra.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks for the update, Simon. There's no doubt this will be controversial, but what I'm wondering, looking at the different classes you've got there, there's 3 categories that are well organised to lobby and apply political pressure. So you've got buses and coaches, the haulage companies, or the haulage movement, I suppose, and also you've got taxis and private hire. So what kind of difficulties do you envisage coming from those categories against private individuals and small companies?
So I think what we're wanting to make sure, so we recognise that were we to introduce any plan that has any form of penalties, that's a change to the business of those organisations. So what we're wanting to do, and the reason why I was talking about the additional engagement activity, is rather than see that as a difficulty to the plan, it's a reality around making sure that we bring the right plan forward. So the engagement that we're kicking off now is all about making sure that we very specifically understand what that means for individual businesses. And that's critical to come back to the other question, which I realised I didn't quite answer for Councillor Stoyer around scrappage schemes. If we understand the implications within individual businesses, that will help us to continue to refine the way that we think about scrappage schemes. Or are there other forms of financial help that we can give to different types of businesses to help them from operating one fleet to operate in another fleet? So our approach, if you like, is let's not see that as a difficulty, let's see it as a reality in terms of getting the plan right.
Thank you. It's following what everybody else has said. What we need to look is also how we can change the behaviour of the people and understanding. Obviously, one is health issue, but if we can't provide affordable, reliable, very linked transport, it will be really, really difficult to get poorer people out of the cars, because people choose using the cars if they can't get on a train, or they're always late for the bus. So these are the reason why quite a lot of people also will use the cars, and if they can't afford the electronic cars, they obviously will go for the cheapest option. So I wouldn't like to see the people who are poorer will actually carry the burden. We have loads of groups as well, loads of small groups, the parents around the school who are trying to campaign to improve their quality. Just wonder what support can you give to those smaller groups, like parents outside the schools who are trying to change, who have idea but obviously might not have a power or kind of enough knowledge to sell the strong argument when they say, well, you shouldn't be parking here or you should turn your engine off. But then there are quite a lot of other aggressive parents will come back, well, I have no choice, I need to. So I just want to see how we can change the behaviour, improve public transport, not cutting the buses or increasing the fares. Thank you.
So improved public transport clearly has to be the start point of any good, sustainable transport plan around a city region, and that's absolutely where our plan starts. But we do have to recognise that there are an awful lot of journeys that are still reliant on cars, taxis, vans and so forth. So we have to strike the balance across the two. I don't know whether Kate wants to comment anymore, but the focus on our part has been to make sure that we put the right information through the channels and then hopefully work with community advocates to pass that information on. But
absolutely, I think it's recognised obviously that there's people that are clearly interested in doing their part to be able to raise awareness, and particularly the point about schools is very well made. So we are working with local authorities to produce toolkits and materials that will enable people that want to raise awareness and what actions they can take. So we've got a website at the moment, the Clean Air Greater Manchester website, which has exactly that sort of information. If you want to make changes yourself or if you want to encourage others, then these are some of the ways that you can do that.
Okay, thank you very much for a thorough debate. I was going to move on to item 6, but I just want permission of everybody if we can take item 7 first, considering we've got a special guest here today, the GMCA himself. Is everybody happy enough with that? Yeah, okay. Can you ask Andy to come in? He was here. Yeah. He's done a runner. Are you all right?
Yeah, sorry. Half asleep then, when you...
You're okay. I thought I'd get you in first, but we didn't realise we were going so quick.
Sorry, yeah.
Okay, everybody, so on item 7, we've got the Greater Manchester Transport Strategy 2040 5-year delivery plan, and we're grateful today that the GMCA, Andy himself, could come here today and discuss this with us. Okay? I'll pass it over to Andy.
Thanks very much, Mark. Morning, everybody. Good to see you all. I'm, coming up to 20 months in to the job, and you may have heard me say this publicly before now. As I kind of sit here today and look to all the ambitions that we have as Greater Manchester, the single biggest potential barrier in the way is our transport system. It feels to me. I think we would all probably agree that last year was a difficult year for people travelling around Greater Manchester. This year, we hope, problems will start to ease on the roads. We hope on the railways, but we're still being given promises that sometimes don't turn into reality. Our own part of the system has held up extremely well in these difficult circumstances, but it's under a lot more pressure as a result of the other problems. So I'm really clear about the scale of the challenge that we've got. Manchester United fans on the committee will be pleased for footballing reasons that the former manager is no longer here, but I'm pleased for transport reasons, actually, that he no longer will be passing a commentary on the transport system on his way to midweek home games, because that was beginning to get some more national attention. And it's not really a joke, really. You know, the problem for us is if it becomes reputational that we have a transport problem, that then could begin to deter potential investors from coming here. So it's very serious, actually. And I think the work we need to do together is just keep working all the time to deal with challenges big and small, to make incremental progress where we can, to keep the system working, keep it improving, and that's what we're seeking to do, working with colleagues at TfGM. So, for instance, next week we see the arrival of the zonal system on Metrolink, something that we've talked about for a long time, but credit to the team, they've actually put together the plan. It is happening. It doesn't kind of solve everything by any means, but it takes our transport system that bit further forward towards a more mature, understandable, integrated system that people might see has shades of what happens in London. And I think that's where we should be aspiring to go, a system of transport that's integrated across the zones, and increasingly, of course, we want to move to integrated ticketing. So, you know, though it is challenging, I also kind of feel extremely well supported by Mark, by all of you, by colleagues at TfGM, and there are lots of things in the pipeline that will begin to make things better. So, you know, I think we've got beginning to get the right grip on it. That then brings me then to the big picture, if you like, in terms of the future of Greater Manchester. And you will all have seen that this week we finally launched the radically revised Greater Manchester Spatial Framework, very deliberately alongside an infrastructure delivery plan for Greater Manchester. The emerging clean air proposals, which you've just been discussing, a new housing vision and strategy. So this time it's not just about building numbers of houses. We're saying we want the right types of homes in the right places. And I think that was probably missing last time that we launched the spatial framework. But crucially, alongside a 5-year delivery plan coming from the Transport 2040 vision, because it was a big criticism of the first iteration of the spatial framework that it wasn't sufficiently linked to transport infrastructure and investment, and in particular not linked to public transport investment. I think you could have mounted the fair criticism of the first GMSF that we were still building for the car, that we were going for big sites off strategic roads that were basically developments for commuting by car, properties with double garages, all the rest of it. Now, you could probably look at the latest draft and point to sites that might still support that argument, but there has been a shift here back towards building closer to public transport infrastructure at the heart of town centres, brownfield preference as a policy. And where we are making transport investment, having that focus on public transport alongside investment in new roads, which of course will always be needed, but also thinking about how do we move people from the car and onto public transport. And I think what's been published this week and the list of schemes that you will have seen begins to paint a much more credible picture about how we manage congestion, improve air quality in the long run, keep this place moving basically by having development that is linked to public transport options. The one scheme I would really point to, you'll have heard about, this is best expressed, this philosophy, through our plans for Stockport Town Centre. Great work. Colleagues in Stockport have already been doing around the regeneration of the town centre, and there's already a lot happening there. We confirmed that we would consult on the idea of the first mayoral development corporation in Greater Manchester, and the first in the country to focus on a town centre in Stockport, in the area around the Arches. That, I think, is quite an exciting development, and it's something that could be open to all of the boroughs represented around this table if we can prove that it works. But linked to it is the plans that TfGM developed with Stockport Council for Stockport interchange. And I think that scheme, it's worth, you know, I pay tribute to everyone who was involved in that. I'm sure committee members were involved in it too. For me, it really is emblematic of the kind of investment I think we need to start thinking about, how we develop public transport infrastructure with quality green space and good public realm as part of it, but also with residential development linked to it too. And I think the scheme, Stockport Interchange, I think is a real exemplar of the kind of clever investment that we need to start making. And TfGM thinking as much about housing development as it does about transport. So not, you know, using the benefit of devolution, which is not silo working, of course, but everybody seeing the bigger picture as to how transport can contribute to the housing crisis, but also to town centre regeneration. So that's where the thinking has been going. I won't go through all of the list of the schemes that was outlined in the delivery plan. We can talk about those in questions if colleagues want to raise any points. What I would want to stress is the point I was saying about giving people alternatives to the car. I've asked the team at TfGM to think seriously about an improved park and ride offer for Greater Manchester. If you go past Birmingham on the M5, I think it is, or Bristol or Cambridge, places like that, cities like those, advertise park and ride very visibly from the motorway. And yet, if you drive around Greater Manchester, I don't think we do that in the same way. I also think we are stuck in quite a traditional mode when it comes to commuting. There's a traditional working day here, 9 till 5, and the traditional way of getting to your place of work is one person sitting in a car. And I think we can all see that if we look at our main roads. So the schemes that I'm wanting to prioritise are schemes that, yes, will add capacity to public transport, but crucially help people to create different ways of commuting. So more parking capacity at Metrolink stops, train stations, designated park and ride. The extension of Metrolink to the Trafford Centre, I think, creates a big opportunity to create a park and ride function west of Greater Manchester off the M60. The Northern Gateway proposal, which is in the spatial framework, again, I would like to see a northern park and ride option off the M60. And of course, you would want in time to think about one east and west. That's the logic I think we've got to be into, thinking of transport investment that prioritises change when it comes to the way people choose to commute. There's so much more I could say. I won't speak at any greater length than what I already have. The one thing I do want to emphasise in closing, though, Chair, is to say to you and through you to all of the members of the committee that this is very much in my mind a shared endeavour. The list that we have published is not a list dreamt up by me or by TfGM in isolation. Of course, the list is very much informed by the priorities that have come through each of the boroughs. And I think looking to the future, it's deepening that level of integration between transport and highways functions in the boroughs with the team at TfGM. That, in my view, is how we're going to really take transport up to the next level in Greater Manchester. You know, there's a good example of it in the early thinking around taxi regulation. You know, how do we develop common ways of working, common standards, not taking power off the districts, but at the centre setting standards that everyone agrees are right, and then bringing that level of coherence to our transport system that, if we're honest, isn't there in the way it should be at the moment. And for taxis, you could also read buses using the powers that we have there to bring a level of kind of standardisation across the system that gives the travelling public then confidence to use the taxis, use the buses. And I think that's the journey that we're on. And we'll only get all of these things right if we do go at it as a partnership. and develop this as a shared mission to improve our transport system. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Andy. Has anybody got any questions? I've got Phil first.
Cheers. Thanks, Chair. If I can thank Andy and his team for the fantastic work they did in South Haywood, in the Haywood corridor, creating thousands of jobs, homes and massive investment to Haywood, especially Rochdale, and also touching on Bury as well. Could you also thank Andy for the suggestion to bring in the Metrolink to Middleton? It would be a massive boost for the local economy. But what I'd like to ask Andy is if you could bring the bus operators to task. We have a very poor bus service in Middleton, Haywood and Rochdale. It's okay, South Manchester, you've got all different types of bus operators. In North Manchester, you're lucky to get on the bus. And, for example, from Middleton to Manchester, it can take up to an hour. We have bus lanes, but we can't afford to put the bus lane cameras in. Maybe Andy could review the bus lane issue with the cameras and come back to this committee and say it can work with us in trying to implement some sort of bus lanes to make it a little bit faster. We're trying to encourage people to get on public transport, but when we've not got the public transport in place in our area, then it's harder for us to do it.
Thanks, Phil. Grateful of obviously what you said, the welcome for the plans that we've put out. I would love to see Metrolink go to Middleton. Challenger, I don't know if you know, but I was a reporter on the Middleton Guardian many years ago, so it has a place in my heart. The issue is, of course, how do we put together finance at a level that will allow it, but also allow expansion of services more broadly, tram, train, other, to really take us up to that next level. And I think what we've all got to do, and this is where the committee will really come into its own, is obviously make that case on a cross-party basis to the government for effectively what we call Transport Fund 2. We've been helped by the National Infrastructure Commission because they have called on the government, this is the government's own commission, to make investment in city regions the top priority. And I think we're going to, all of us going into the spending review, need to kind of muster our efforts to make that case for investment at scale in our city regional network, which would then allow the kind of extensions that you're rightly calling for. In terms of buses, I mean, I've long said we've got a dysfunctional bus market. It's dysfunctional in many ways in terms of the way it works, and we all know that. But it's also dysfunctional geographically, in that the south of the city region is a very different market, let's say, to the north. And that then creates a challenge when you try and bring some logic to how you get the balance between the two. What I can say to you is that I'm as ready as anybody to move on the reform of our buses in Greater Manchester. The only issue is how our bus what are the financial implications of it, given that the operators are in different positions with regard to their own financial stability. They are cutting routes still, and we just have to understand the full implications of what it will take to get those decent bus services in the north of the conurbation that you're rightly calling for. Some of it is within our gift, in terms of bus lanes and how do we make the bus experience better for people travelling in from the north. And that's a point I'm happy to take on board and work with the team at TfGM and you to see if we can look at what and where colleagues would like to see enhanced bus priority. I know the bus operators call for that, but we're all reeling a little bit under the weight of roadworks, and obviously we'd have to sort of pursue that very carefully. But I think this is where maybe we think about bus priority linked to Chris Boardman's work, and to see if the Oxford Road example could be taken elsewhere, where we kind of we rethink the streets with all road users in mind, pedestrians and cyclists as well as bus users, to see if we can do more of those kind of schemes across the city region. But no, I'm happy to take that point back on board and see if we can help.
Okay, I'll take two at a time. I've got John, then there, and then Dory.
Thanks, Chair. I very much welcome the Mayor's opening remarks, in which it should be noted that he managed to mention favourably the word Stockport more times than I've managed in the whole of the last year. So you're off to a flyer in that respect with me. What I'd like to do is to also link to your early remark about incremental progress, because I think that's often the way to get things done. But at the far end of incremental progress is getting things onto the radar. And I wanted to look at the map on page 41, which is aspirational with regards to potential rail and Metrolink stations to come. And those are obviously at different levels of potential at the moment. And I'd like to start off with a plug for the only location outside GM, and I'm particularly pleased to see that it's on here because it shows that we're seeing transport in a wide perspective. And my interest in Gamesley, which is the eastmost label on that drawing, is that I used to manage the housing estate there when it was in the days when it was managed by Manchester Council. And I know the benefit that was achieved by getting the station into Hattersley, which is obviously a much bigger estate, but a less remote estate than Gamesley. And my challenge back to you, Mr. Mayor, is that I asked for this 40 years ago as a housing officer, and if it can be delivered in the next 25 years, I've got a chance of responding favourably to the invitation to be present when it's inaugurated. So that's my first comment on that. But also on this drawing, are a couple of stations which I'm sure you're fairly familiar with by now, one of which is Reddish South and the other one Denton, which are actually still in receipt of the parliamentary train, and therefore they've got platforms, people can travel to and from them, albeit on a very tokenistic basis. But in terms of making incremental gains, they obviously fit the prospect of being brought back to offering a serious rail service. And the last one is the sequence of potential stations along the rail line east-west, which goes from near Altrincham to Stockport, which again is in place as a freight line and would offer us Timperley East, Bagley, Gatley North, Cheadle and Adswood as a job lot of connectivity, which I think also that line could be spliced into the style line to facilitate access to the airport. So I think potentially by getting these things onto the radar early and by doing the spade work, that as and when we're in a position to attract the sort of funding necessary to float some of these schemes into reality, we should be there with a drawer full of plans ready to roll. So I see your speech as basically offering that prospect across the whole gamut of the transport environment, but particularly in terms of modal shift and moving the maximum amount of people at the maximum speed with the minimum fuss, I think that drawing is a good place to be.
Well, thanks very much, John.
I do, as it happens. I very strongly agree with everything that you've said. Oh, only on one point do I disagree. It's not just Gamesley that is out of Greater Manchester. I'm sure Councillor Grundy will confirm that Kenyon is also outside of Greater Manchester. Indeed, Glaisbury would be as well if that came into being. That is a bit controversial, you could say, in that, you know, why are we looking outside? But there are parts of our city region where you do have to think slightly beyond our borders if you're to solve the transport problem, because the railway lines in certain places don't go through our communities because of those cuts that you go back to the 60s and 70s. So there are some schemes here that we would probably need to work in partnership with High Peak in the case of Gamesley, Warrington in the case of Kenyon or Glaisbury. But I'm really clear. I'm very wedded to this plan. I think this should be prioritised in my view. I think I have said to the team, I understand that we all need to make some investment in roads, but if it was a choice, I would rather invest in public transport. You know, we really do need to break the cycle of building for the car. And I would hope, I mean, some of them, Denton, Reddish South, absolutely. It's a nonsense in this day and age with our roads choked that we have stations that have perfectly viable potential services and we're not taking advantage of that. And, you know, as we go to the new rail franchise, I think it's important that we all make a very united case about expansion of services. I mean, going to the long run, I'm beginning to think about how we respond to the Williams review of rail franchising and consider how do we get more ability to control commuter rail services in Greater Manchester so that we're not petitioning Network Rail or the government. We actually are more able to do it ourselves, either through train or tram train. And I think that is part of the solution too. And a final promise to you, I was going to say, when GMCA Station becomes a reality, yeah, I will stand back and let you cut the ribbon. So.
Okay, Doreen.
First of all, I'd like to welcome your comments about Park and Ride, because I've said it for a long time. Nobody's getting me out of my car from my front door, especially if it's raining. But I do now drive to Ashton, Park and Ride and get on the tram. They absolutely work, and I think it's the way forward. My question, Chairman, is really about the format. The delivery plan is fine. I don't have a problem with that. But you've got, it's a consultation, and it says intervention, rational, cost. Well, the cost is low, medium or high. I mean, first of all, have all these schemes been costed? And secondly, there's no parameters of what's high, like is 5 million high, is 2 million high? It doesn't tell me anything at all. So if you can answer that, that's fine.
No, thanks, Doreen. Thank you for what you said on Park and Ride. You know, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, it works if the quality's there, isn't it? That's the point, isn't it? It doesn't work if you're left standing in a car park and there's, you know, and I think the experience with the Lee Guided Busway has shown us that if the quality is right, people will do it.
Well, they do.
But you know, there's no point if you can't match it then with the quality service. In terms of the 5-year delivery plan, absolutely they've all been costed, and maybe Simon would want to say something. I think the more aspirational you get, maybe it becomes a bit more hazy. But the 5-year delivery plan it is costed. The question is, where does it all come from? We've got an allocation from the Transforming Cities Fund, which the government, which I praise the government for giving us. So we've got 3 years of allocation. I think we're in the second year at the moment. We're in the second year of 3 at the moment, 4 at the moment, aren't we? And obviously cycling and walking has taken the early priority. But we've got a 5th year allocation now, and some of these schemes, which is around £70 million, some of these schemes will draw on that. But one of the reasons for having a much clearer transport plan alongside the spatial framework is, of course, to capture potential developer contributions to transport schemes and not losing those in other, to make sure that transport gets the focus. So, Simon, would you like to say a little more? I mean, there is more detail that the committee could be given, I'm sure, if it wanted it.
So, it's a really helpful observation. We'll make sure when we produce the final plan that we deal with that. As broad planning parameters, anything that's low cost is what we would generally understand as the committee as a minor scheme, so below £5 million expenditure. Medium cost are what you would call a small major scheme, so probably within the order of 5 to 10, 5 to 15 million pounds, and then the high cost schemes are then those large programmes, a tram train conversion, for example, where we get into large numbers. Perfectly understand. Yeah.
Okay, James.
Mr. Chairman, obviously, I think Andy was pretty much knew what I was going to speak on and ask about, but I absolutely welcome the inclusion of the Kenyon Junction site for a feasibility study in this. As Andy knows, It's an issue that I've been campaigning on for many years. I know he himself has always said, both as an MP and now as Mayor, that he would like to see a station return to the Lee area. I do think that this is one of the ideal sites. Obviously, unlike many other sites, it's something where we're far further ahead because the site owner has already, when he rented the site out for the basically Network Rail, when they did part of the work on that line, as the part of the payment for the site, he had them do a feasibility study and a design for a new station. So we already had copies of those. If his office doesn't have one, because we've got some, I'll make sure his office has copies of those. As he says, currently the site lies just outside Greater Manchester, but I'd certainly be willing to help work with him on. We could use what's known as a statutory instrument known as an electoral amendment order, which, because the site is directly adjacent to Greater Manchester, is basically a very small use of a statutory instrument by right of the Minister to basically move the border so that the site is included within Greater Manchester. It's a relatively short procedure. As you can tell, we've done a fair bit of work on this over the years. Obviously, the one thing that I'm disappointed not to see, but I understand perhaps why, is that the completion of the Atherley Way bypass isn't in there. But I will say, great stuff so far, one major project at a time for the one village. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, James, and I was hoping you would say that, but you know, it does have a long history, as we both know. And the reason why this, you know, isn't just a local discussion between James and myself is because this is obviously very critically linked to the East Lancashire Road and the volumes of traffic that come down the East Lancashire Road. And at the moment, there are many communities down it. If you go all the way from Boothstown, Mosley Common, right the way through Astley, Tilsley, Lee, Loughton, Goulburn, there's no Ashton and Makerfield, there's no public transport alternative for those commuters. You know, links to the west of Greater Manchester are poor. If you are travelling by train, there's a train stop at Newtonley Willows, but then there's nothing. The trains travel all the way under Greater Manchester, and there's often nothing, Patricroft sometimes, but straight into... So the capacity is there, and yet we're not giving communities access to the capacity. So I think this is strategic. I'm really encouraged by what you say about the work that the owner of the site has done with Network Rail. I would like to see an ambitious proposal developed for Kenyon, which actually could link to the extension of the Atherley Way, not as an open access road, but as part of Park and Ride. I wonder whether or not, to pick up some concerns that may come from Warrington about access from the south, whether this is very much a Park and Ride facility with Park and Ride off the East Lancashire Road, whereby then a link would be created from there for people parking down to Kenyon Junction using an extension of the Atherley Way. And the challenge I'm going to put to the team at TfGM is, why couldn't the Lee guided busway turn round at that, you know, be the shuttle that kind of operates between this station and you know, why couldn't we integrate those two things? Because then I think you are getting towards an integrated solution that the Lee area has long lacked. And I would be really pleased to work with you closely on this to see if we can drive it with real momentum and pace. If the development is coming that Wigan Council seek just north of the East Lancashire Road, I think this investment is critically linked to it, in my view. We cannot keep building for the car user down the East Lancs. It can't carry on because it can't take the volume anymore. So I'd be really pleased to work with you on that to see if we can make this finally a reality. And it might need your help with colleagues on Warrington Borough Council who may not necessarily completely share our view.
Okay, thanks for that, Barry.
Thank you. First of all, I don't have a car, so I don't pollute. I travel, my mode of transport is buses and taxis, of course. Well, this morning, part of my journey was on by taxi because of the times of the buses to get me on the main Manchester route. We're finding out, we're travelling on buses every day, that it cost me £1 more in a taxi than it would on the bus. So what I'm saying is, and people are complaining every day, only yesterday I had 3 on me about the prices the buses are putting on, the fares. They're finding out that it's coming cheaper to go in a taxi than it is to travel on a bus. I mean, we're here to try and get people onto buses. And as I use buses every day, I certainly know that a lot of people are saying it's in a bit, it won't be worth using buses. Like I said, it cost me just £1 more. I travelled about 2 miles. It cost me £3 in a taxi. If I got on the bus, it's £2 on the bus. So that's from door to door. So what I'm trying to say is we should try and get bus companies to keep the fares a bit lower. Because every year we find here that the bus fares are going up every year. They've done it again this year. And I've been on here a long time, since '92 actually. And, you know, fares increase all the time. And it's difficult for us to get people on buses if the fares keeps going up like they are going up. They make enough profits without that. And like I said, it's very important that we try and get across, that try and keep the fares a bit lower. Thanks.
I couldn't agree with you more, Barry. The bus system in Greater Manchester is trapped in what you call a vicious circle, in that services have been going down, routes have been cut, patronage has been falling, and consequently, to mitigate that, they then keep putting fares up, but that then keeps patronage falling. And that's the challenge that we're looking at, isn't it? You know, how do you reverse that decline? How do London manage to offer a £1.50 fare, or even £1, isn't it, the hopper fare? You know, how do they do that? They do it, going back to what I was saying to Doreen, they have a quality product, you know, a good environment on the buses, and it's just easy to use. And therefore, you've got much higher numbers of people using the buses, and therefore, prices can be at that level. So they've got the opposite of us. We've got a vicious circle that keeps going that way, and they've got a virtuous sort of a system that's going in the other direction. And that has got to change. But the only thing I would say is I look at the whole question of bus reform. We shouldn't underestimate how hard it is to go from where we are today to where I think we would all like to be in let's say 10 years' time. In the 30 years since deregulation, I'm pretty certain, and starting to be corrected from Bob or someone else if I've got this wrong, but bus patronage has pretty much gone down every year in Greater Manchester in the 30 years since deregulation. And that you've got to stop that decline on one level. I'm told, you know, you're saying about a taxi being cheaper. I hear all the time that young people four of them will get an Uber. It's much cheaper for them to do that than it is to get the bus. Now, you're never going to get a grip on road congestion if that is the reality of the transport market. So obviously we need to do something. The opportunity pass that I spoke of earlier this week, free bus travel for 16 to 18-year-olds, is in my view absolutely designed to be a kind of early builder of stopping that decline, getting a younger generation regular bus users, and then converting them into regular passengers in their late teens, early 20s. That is a big part of the logic behind that policy. But I also kind of looking at the challenge of bus reform and some of the operators that we've got, I am thinking about whether or not we need more before we really embrace the whole challenge. Shouldn't we have an operator of last resort option here like we have on the railways? Because if we're always in the grip of the private operators, whichever system you're running, I think that's always going to present problems. What we've got to do is find a way of making sure it's the public interest that comes first when it's our buses are at stake, and then we get the market to work for our interest rather than what is happening at the moment. The market's deciding its best interest and then foisting its bad decisions on the travelling public. So it's a real big challenge. I'm in complete agreement with you. I'm ready to move as quickly as we can to start turning this thing around, but I'm under no illusions about the scale of the challenge that we face.
Which we've always said in the past, that Barry, that's right.
Absolutely, Barry.
Stuart?
Thank you. And I think this is a tremendous report. It addresses a lot of the main points which you needed addressing, and in particular like the idea of the new potential tram stops and rail stations. And I'm particularly pleased that Lostock Parkway on the Wigan line is being included. But I do feel that on the idea of the tram train is obviously something which needs to be investigated thoroughly. I know there's the new one on this Sheffield to Rotherham, but I think we're missing a point that we've not considered a station for Logistics North, because it is a huge distribution area in South Bolton. And there's the Atherton to Manchester Railway line just at the bottom. I have spoken to the people who own the site, and they were willing to make land available for a location of a station, and I think it would be a tremendous advantage for getting access for people from various parts of the county into work at Logistics North, and I'd just like to make a plug for that. I know it's a difficult one, and obviously with the tram lines, and I don't demur from the need to get the tram into Middleton, but if there's any consideration could be given to utilising, I know that the line has been looking into the options. I know the line has been built over in several places, utilising the old Bolton to Ratcliffe Central railway line for a tram consideration, with stops at Darcy Lever and South Braemar, which is not particularly well off part of Bolton, and for North Radcliffe. I think it could do a lot of easing of the traffic congestion on Bolton and Bury. Thank you.
Thank you, Stuart. I'm going to ask Simon if he wouldn't mind to pick up the specific suggestion around a station for Logistics North. I mean, I'll just say something to pick up the broader point, if that's okay. And it's to develop something I said earlier around what's called the Williams Review. So I'm sure the committee is aware there's this review of rail franchising taking place. And I think through you and through colleagues at TfGM, we need to really look at this as a big opportunity for Greater Manchester to get more control over the network, which then might stop some of the bureaucracy that allows us to open new stations and improve station infrastructure as well. You know, we asked for devolution of stations, and we didn't get that. If we had have done, I think we'd have had an even better spatial framework, to be honest with you, because I think we'd have been making even more use of our transport assets when it comes to housing growth. But the Williams Review, I think, is an opportunity, because I think my experience of dealing with the whole debacle last year and trying to work through Transport for the North, the whole system lacks focus. It's unaccountable. It's way too complicated. And I'm increasingly of the view that we need to think about making a case for taking our own commuter rail lines more directly under our control and integrating it with our tram, and hopefully with a reformed bus market, in the way that Merseyside already have. They have Merseyrail, and that's much more, under their control. And I'm thinking, well, why couldn't we make a case for GM rail, you know, something that is more directly under our control? Because then it would open up, I think, the whole question of tram train would then really open up, I think, where you could run train services, then tap into the Metrolink system as opposed to creating the congestion that we see in the central Manchester rail corridors. So I think, you know, you're touching on, I think, a big opportunity for us. We're not going to meet our transport ambitions if we're always sort of going cap in hand to Network Rail, pleading for a station here or an extra service there. You know, we need to have the ability to get hold of this system and integrate it with Metrolink, integrate it with the buses. That's what we've got to be aiming towards. And you know, I'm hopeful that the Williams review will give us just that opportunity to make that case. But Simon, would you like to pick up the specific on Logistics North?
So there's a number of development activities around that broader Logistics North and Little Hulton area, and clearly one of the things that we've been looking at in terms of thinking about a rail station within that locality is where might you best position things to benefit from density of demand, not only at a point in the day, if you like, but right through the day, which is what alighted us on the thinking principally around the Little Hulton station instead, and then thinking about how we use first and last mile transport links from Little Hulton into Logistics North. So if Councillor Haslam would find it helpful, more than happy to set up an additional discussion and we just talk you through the transport planning thinking that we'd had around Logistics North.
On the old Ratcliffe to Bolton line.
So we are aware of it. We have set out within the delivery plan that there's long-term thinking that we need to do in terms of improving orbital connectivity between pairs of town centres, and clearly Bury and Bolton is an important linkage in that regard. In the nearer term, what we want to be able to do is build up the public transport market again between the two towns, and that's why we've been thinking through the concept of quality bus transit that we talk about in the delivery plan. In the longer term, there are some routes. There are some real challenges. There are houses in Breakmouth that sit on the well, that's another time. But we are working through the options when we look at the longer term. Yeah.
Just quickly, Simon, could tram trains at Atherton present any opportunity for Logistics North, or is it too?
It's that line, and building a service along that line clearly then helps us to build a case for stations along that line.
Okay, I've got Stephen.
Thanks, Chair, and good morning, Mr. Mayor. Thanks very much for coming today. I've got a couple of points to raise, if you don't mind, and hopefully they'll be short. And you might have heard a little bit before about it, so please bear with me. Firstly, you mentioned the issues around Stockport and the regeneration, the work that's going on, which is excellent. I live in Marple, and we haven't got a rail link, Metrolink route into Stockport at the moment, which we're absolutely desperate for, and I'm aware that there is the proposals for it to take place, but we're absolutely desperate for some way to try and get the vehicles off the road, not just for journeys into Stockport and back again, but also for people who work in the towns surrounding Stockport, Bramwell, Poynton and onwards. But the other thing I was going to mention is just regarding, again, getting vehicles off the road, to do with public transport. One of the things that I've always thought is we need a huge amount of trust in how the public perceive public transport. For instance, the Saturday strikes recently haven't gone down at all well, obviously, on the rail system. And indeed, in the morning, getting from Marple through the main centre, through the main rail links into Manchester, there's only ever 2 carriages. Now, I'm sure it's not the only place, but once you get to Gorton, which is the 4th or 5th stop down, you can't get on. So the knock-on effect is everyone gets back in the cars and drives in. And an example of that is one of my work colleagues, he finishes work at 7 o'clock from his shift, but he won't drive to Gorton where he works because he can't guarantee to get home so he'll drive. So I do feel that one of the big things that we need to do is have as much as educate people about the benefits of public transport, is to give them a real sense of trust as well, because cancellations don't work, and I know you've heard it before from people, but for me a big thing is the trust element.
Thanks, Stephen. And I really couldn't agree more, to be honest. I asked TfGM last year what effect was the rail collapse having on our road system, because people clearly did abandon rail for the car because they couldn't trust the rail services anymore. And on certain routes, Bob said to me that about 5% extra road traffic. So this is why that trust in public transport matters, doesn't it? You know, if it isn't there, you see a very big impact pretty quickly in terms of road congestion. And I think that's what we felt last year. You know, we obviously had the roadworks as well, so we had a bit of a perfect storm. People had given up on the railways, particularly at the weekends, as you mentioned. I'll come back to the RMT issue in a minute. And that then put extra pressure on the roads when they weren't really in a position to take that extra pressure. So trust in public transport is crucial. I have found the rail industry very difficult to deal with. You know, I come back more from an NHS background when it comes to my former ministerial life. The NHS is far more accountable than the rail industry in terms of the data it puts out there, the accountability that it has to people. You know, the PPM measure, the headline measure for management of the rail industry, doesn't tell you actually what the passenger experience is, you know, whether or not trains are arriving on time or not. The experience is often the overcrowding, the unpleasant travelling environment. But short forming of trains, until recently, isn't captured in the headline management of the franchise. So it doesn't necessarily connect with that passenger experience. And that's what damages trust, isn't it? So if companies are saving costs by short forming trains, passengers have a really bad experience, they could be meeting their franchise, but actually delivering a very poor service to the public. And I met the rail delivery group yesterday, and I said this to them, you know, they've got to get much more focused on the whole experience, build trust. How the fare increase was justified, I honestly don't know, because, anyway, we won't go into all of that today. But, you know, this industry has lost confidence on a pretty major scale, I think, and it should be thinking of every way it now can win people back to the railways instead of potentially deterring them with fare increases. And then I'll come back to the other point, taking staff off the trains. I'm not going to come here and just take the RMT line. I'm not. That's not what I would never unquestionably do that. But I think they have a point in saying that if you take staff off trains, you are not going to build public confidence in use of the railways, particularly amongst older people, disabled people. I wouldn't be actually that happy as a parent of teenage daughters than being on trains later at night with no member of staff in an authority position on the train. And indeed, the pressure I often get from the Greater Manchester public is to put more staff on Metrolink, particularly in Oldham, Rochdale area where there have been challenges. So I can't see how at this moment in time, taking guards off trains is going to help bring more people back on to trains. I think where and to be fair, the government has actually come round a bit and agrees with that. The issue has become the two sides are entrenched, and I don't see on the part of the operator a willingness to solve this dispute, because it's also got a dispute running on Sundays, a totally different dispute, where we've got cancellations of services on a Sunday, totally within its gift to solve it, but it just allows it to rumble on, and I think it finds the slack it gives it helpful, to be honest with you. It's helpful to that operator, I think, to have these weekends where it can get itself ready for Monday to Friday again. But that's not acceptable. This industry is failing people. So I'm working quite hard to try and get the two sides back together. They're actually what they're debating now is not whether there should be a second member of staff on the trains, because the government, as I say, has accepted that. It's what are the exceptional circumstances whereby a train will still be allowed to leave if there wasn't a second member. You know, that's where the debate is. And that is solvable as far as I'm concerned, and I wish to get round the table and solve it. So that's the update on that. And yes, it's very, very frustrating. But you know, we've got to see the rail industry improve throughout this year, and build that confidence back, because we can't afford it to be where it is at the moment. But Simon, do you want to pick up the Marple point as well?
Certainly. It's a corridor that we've identified for some time as having real potential over the longer term for tram-train conversion. What would that allow us to do? In principle, it would allow us to increase the frequency of the service from Marple and Rosehill through to central Manchester. It would also allow us to take that service off the rail system as it approaches central Manchester and bring it in instead on the light rail system, which would allow us then to deal with a number of the central Manchester congestion issues that also undermine the performance of that corridor. But they're long-term solutions. They aren't solutions to the problem overnight. Many of the issues that Andy's talked about are clearly critical in that regard.
Okay, now I've got quite a long list, and I know the Mayor has to leave for meetings come 12 o'clock. So if all the 454 people remaining would like to try and keep it as brief as possible, I'd appreciate it. So, Roger?
Well, naturally, I agree with most of what Andy said, but the one point I'd press you on is on budget and funding. And I'm not trying to be clever when I say this, but trams are fantastic. But as you know, every line is 350 to 400 million pound. And I think TfGM and yourself, I think we should be spending the next 12 months looking at third generation trams and seeing if we can drive the cost down to half that level. Because on the all-party parliamentary light rail group, they've now got videos of hydrogen trams, battery-operated trams, and I just feel that we've got to reinvent this system. Not that there's anything wrong with the tram, but to actually modernise it so that we can get it round town centres at a fraction of the cost now. The other issue is you've mentioned bus reform on a number of occasions. Now, it's an obvious statement to make. There's no point in the Mayor of Greater Manchester having the powers to run buses if the bus service gets worse. It's got to get better. You might want to freeze the fares. If you want to do any of these things, there's a 40, 50, 60 million pound cost, in my opinion, to this. And of course, that's where transport funding, infrastructure, we've just got to look again at the funding cost, because I'm with your programme. The question is, can we get the funding to support it?
Thanks, Roger. Well, I absolutely agree with you. I think we do need to be in the business of thinking creatively, looking to the future, seeing how we can do a lot of this as quickly and as cost effectively as we possibly can. I think if we were to take more control over the whole system, you get economies of scale and opportunities to, tram train offers opportunities, doesn't it, to reduce the cost. So I agree with you, and obviously with the team will have heard that, and I think we all have got an obligation to challenge ourselves on that. On the second point on buses, you're right. If I had the subsidy levels that London have, then I think we could be moving more quickly, if you like, in that the money would just be there. Instead, the system that we've got is, I would probably have to use the mayoral precept to raise money to start to reform the bus service, and I think in the way that most of us around the table want to see. The slight delay is that the order that allows me the legal power to raise that precept is still not in place. I think we're still waiting for it to be laid in the Commons. We're told it's coming soon, but it still isn't there, and that's an issue. But that bigger issue is where we all need to make an argument. We've got to be arguing, I think, for what London gets, we should get, and that should also mean more revenue support to pay for day to day a world-class transport system that people can afford. And it's not a criticism necessarily of just the current government, it's all governments. All governments have shortchanged the North when it comes to transport, capital and revenue. And actually the revenue side of it is arguably even more important, because it leads you to the situation that Barry described, where buses are so expensive it almost becomes better to get a taxi. The revenue that we need to fund what we, I think we'll try, but, raising it all locally might be a stretch to deliver everything that you want and I want from an expanded bus network. Well, we could go as far as we can go, but I think if we want a London-style system, I think we need London-level subsidies to make it work.
Noel?
Thanks, Chair. Thanks for coming, Mr Mayor. Similar to Barry's point, really, with regards to Manchester's aspirations compared to London's, I think there's two issues here. The first one's cost, which we've discussed, but the second one's stigma. Public transport is disproportionately expensive in Manchester compared to London. But in London, public transport is an accepted fact of life. It's it's a necessity. Whereas in Manchester, as I say, and other places, it seems to be stigmatised. So apart from making public transport more affordable, how do you make it more attractive as well across Greater Manchester rather than in pockets, as Phil's alluded to? In South Manchester, public transport, the buses in particular, it is an attractive offer, whereas in Rochdale, in Bury, it's not at all. It is a postcode lottery.
That's a really good point. No, I think often people don't know what they're going to get, do they, when they step on a bus here, or when they go on a train, or indeed get in a taxi, because taxis are part of the public transport system. In London, there are clear standards. People know what they're going to get, and therefore, going back to Stephen's point, the trust is higher in what public transport will deliver. Here, it's more of a lottery. And that is what, in my view, has got to change. The reason I am quite keen on seeing taxi reform, working with you all and working with the districts, is if we had, in my view, a single livery taxi that was running to single standards in terms of emissions, driver training, safety checks, quality of the vehicle, age of the vehicle, all of those things, that builds trust, in my view. Because if you can see a single colour taxi operating, or everyone knows and has a sense of what that will mean if you were to step inside. Whereas at the moment we don't have that. The same is true of buses. It's a mismatch of stuff. You don't quite know what the fare, well, you don't know what the fare is going to be for a start off, because they all do their, as we just heard from Barry, different fares. But you also don't know whether there'll be audio-visual announcements for people who are deaf or visually impaired. You don't know the level of disability access. It varies whether drivers are going to stop or not and do it. You need a standardisation, in my view, that this is what you get when you step on a bus, tram, train. I think the tram provides it, but it's the only bit of our system that provides it. And that, I think, is the issue. And it can't be won overnight. But you've got to get to a level of standardisation that guarantees a level of quality that then builds that public trust over the long run.
Okay, thanks for that. John?
Thank you, Chair. I think we can all very warmly welcome the aspirational expansion of light rail in Greater Manchester. But just following on from what Roger said and from what Phil said, my concern is how much of this realistically are we going to be able to deliver? When I met officers to discuss possible or potential light rail expansion schemes, there are certain schemes that appear on a nice, neat diagram, the ones like to Middleton, around the airport link, but other ones that are on your plan don't appear on that plan. So how realistic is it that we can deliver all of these proposals? And in terms of the tram train options, Simon referred to one of the big advantages is taking the tram trains off the rail lines and then running them through the city centre. In terms of capacity through the city centre, how many extra city crossings would we actually require to deliver on all these proposals? Because one of the challenges is a lot of people who aren't currently covered by the Metrolink network say, oh, the city centre's had a second city crossing. But of course, it's about expanding capacity through the city centre. And there is going to be a political implication of trying to explain to people about the need to expand the capacity through the city centre to deliver on this scheme. And then my other point was in relation to cycle and bus priority. One of the things that frustrates me the most is when we build new developments, we don't automatically have cycle lanes on all new streets. I would hope that as part of this plan, we'll see a guarantee that we're going to see cycle lanes on every new road, whether it's a busy new main road or whether it's a quiet residential street. We ought to be encouraging cycling by having them integrated in every new development. And while I agree that we don't want to expand the road network, where we do need to expand the road network, surely we also must be ensuring that that road network has automatic bus priority included in those new networks.
Thanks, John. No, they're all very fair points. I mean, just to break it down a bit, where things are more in our gift, we can be firmer when you were asking about how likely are things to happen. So if it's new Metrolink stops, for instance, we can be quite firm about that. So as you'll see in the plan, Elton Reservoir, Sandhills, Cop Road, I think there's a high degree of certainty about those, because obviously they're within a price bracket that we can deliver. When it comes to Metrolink extension, be it to Middleton or indeed probably sooner to the airport, we don't control. We can't raise the level of funding that would allow for that. So there is a scheme, as colleagues will know, sitting on the Secretary of State's desk around expansion of Metrolink to the airport past the new terminal. We can't say to you this morning we're certain it will go ahead, because obviously it's a decision that's not entirely within our not in our control, because that requires government support, and that's why I think we need to carry on working together to make that cross-party appeal for the funding of a scale that will take us where we want to be and deliver this plan. That will be true of the city centre, not just in terms of Metrolink capacity, but in terms of rail capacity. A big cause of the problems I was describing, that when response to Stephen's question, is capacity constraints on the rail network running through central Manchester. And I think you're going to have to solve these things in the round. Tram-train needs to look at also the capacity of the rail system, and the two need to sort of work together to see how you can get the level of capacity through Manchester city centre that then doesn't create blockages elsewhere. And that I think is the piece of work that needs to be done. On cycling, walking, I'd agree with you wholeheartedly. It should be a condition of any new road development. There is cycling provision. I hope Chris Boardman will be coming to the committee soon. I don't know when he was here last, but it'd be really important for you to hear from him. I mean, he would certainly agree with that. I think he is calling for districts as well, rather than just us at TfGM. I think districts need to, perhaps apply a greater degree of urgency to cycling, walking schemes, and also perhaps display that thinking that you're calling for, where it's an automatic that you have the best possible cycling and walking provision in any new road schemes.
Okay, I've got Kate.
Thank you, Chair. You'll be pleased to hear that I've edited down all my questions and my comments to one that is more aimed at you than it is at Andy, but I wanted to ask the committee this while Andy was in the room. Just going back to your earlier point, Andy, about what this committee can do to support your aims and the aims of the combined authority, and what further lobbying that we could do as a committee and possibly take in other councillors from around GM to make those those crucial points about adequate and appropriate investment to just unlock the huge potential that this region has, and also to lobby for improved integration across all the transport networks in terms of ticketing and management of services, services and the infrastructure.
Well, thanks, Kate, and I'm glad you've raised that, because it gives me an opportunity to thank the committee for the work it has done. I think we have been in a process of reviewing committees in relation, because before the combined authority, and then particularly before the mayor was elected, whoever that mayor would have been, we've been in a bit living in two different worlds, and we've had the same debate with fire as well. You know, it created a confusing sort of situation. And as colleagues will know, we've been having a long debate about, well, what's the role of the committee, what's the size, and I know that's been probably frustrating for colleagues, and it has been a bit for me as well. I think where it comes out is the committee has a really important function. Getting this degree of coordination that I've been talking about today, it is shared. I want to come back to that. This isn't stuff dreamt up by me and it's got to be shared. We won't get, I mean, John's point about cycling, it will not happen unless the buy-in comes bottom up as well as, the funding top. You've got to get this as a shared journey that we're all buying into together. And I think what I observe, and have observed, if I'm honest, in my first 20 months, is the degree of coordination districts to TfGM is not as good as it should be. It should be closer, it should be tighter, it should be more focused. I mean, you could look at that with regard to roadworks. Actually, they do a good job, and there's is it called the RAP system, and the way in which we try and manage things as a city region is good, but it could be better. And that is what we need to get to. That I had a really big experience last year where I think it was a couple of Saturdays before Christmas, where Metrolink had problems, the Christmas markets were on, United were at home, it was not good, it was. And I remember talking to Bob after it and finding out that we didn't have 24/7 control, and it brought home to me that we're not managing the system at a level that we would probably aspire the city to be at, which is a world-class city that runs as good as any second city, if we can put it that way, anywhere in Europe or the world. And I think we kind of recognise there's a need to raise our game here. And you raise the game not by the centre taking over everything, because that will never work either. You raise the game by having a much higher degree of coordination, districts to centre and back again, and doing it together. And I think taxis were looking at doing that, bus reform were looking at doing that, that for me is where the committee will really can come into its own in the coming years. I hope that makes sense.
And that's what most of our meetings have been about, haven't they, Andy? Steve?
Can I just very quickly? I think on bus reform, I mean, I go back to a conversation with Roger a year or so ago. Sorry, Steve, just to say this. That will only work, if you take that as an example, if the districts are articulating really clearly what they want from bus reform, from a very local point of view. Routes, bus stops, services, whatever. And only you can do that. You could never get that right if you were doing it all from the centre. So, that for me, I mean, I want, maybe Mark and I need to sort of put some ideas for debate to you, but really itemising the areas where the committee can add most value is, I think, what we need to do and make a real impact in terms of transport in your communities. And bus reform, tax, you know the areas, and I think we probably need to kind of develop a work programme, don't we, that will really then allow that process to really kind of come into its own.
Right, thank you, Chair. A couple of points. I've scrubbed off some of the points I wanted to make, but I welcome the report. Obviously, it's a fantastic report, and I think if a fraction of it was to be implemented, it would be really good. One local issue first, predominantly on the Metrolink locally. I think obviously I live halfway down the Metrolink line, and of course it's virtually impossible to get onto it in rush hour. I know Andy's reforms on the new ticket thing, but that isn't going to help a great deal, I don't think, or isn't helping. And I think obviously what does seem to happen is obviously people come in from outside of the conurbation, they stop at the edge of the thing and they get on it. So I welcome in part of the reports where it talks about potential new links from edges of the conurbations that can take people straight into the city centre, and thereby hopefully it can leave like the Metrolinks for the people who live along the line to actually be able to make use of them, because it's virtually impossible to get onto it. By the time it gets up to like where I live, halfway down it, you can't get on it. So I think that sort of thing needs to be looked at. The other point generally I want to talk about the report in its whole, and generally about how we can get people back on into public transport. I think there are a number of problems as I see it. And you talked a lot about quality, which I think is good. I mean, that's one part of it. And people have mentioned fares and affordability, and that's another element as well. I think one of the other elements that I think are particularly important to myself, I think comes across from people I speak to, is making it a 24-hour access. Because at the moment, it's no good having some services there, or some that are too expensive, but it's got to be available 24 hours. I mean, I don't know how people working in the city, I've spoken with one or two people who work in the city centre, and if you're a reveller, you can get back home from the city centre at night through taxis. But if you're working till 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, how do you realistically get back? The trams stop running around midnight. That you're lucky if you can get an all-night bus. I think, you know, so we've got to have all these things practical. I mean, again, look at the airport. I mean, if you're flying out early morning and getting back late night, you can't use public transport. Okay, you might be able to get a bus, train into the city centre, but you can't get a bus or tram back out to your local area. You're speaking about taxis all the time in that sense of it. Also, we've got people working in edges. You know, you might go in places like Trafford Park. I mean, putting the Metrolink to one side, which go on a dedicated route, there are other places as well where people are working sort of different strange hours beside 9-5, and they haven't always got access to public transport properly, or very limited. So I think one of the things in order to make a transport system that actually really work, I think it's got to do with those factors, not just about quality, not just about fares. And fares is very important because I think some of it is very expensive. It's one of the most expensive ones. I think we do need to get the fares affordability, but it's also making a 24-hour service. We talk about the city centre being 24 hours. Well, it's not really 24 hours. If you can't get a public transport there 24 hours a day, I think this needs to be rolled out across the conurbation as well. I think for this to actually really work and to get people to change from cars, I think we really need to make it 24 hours. We need to make it affordability as well as quality. Thank you.
Well, yeah, again, couldn't agree more with what you say. I mean, on capacity, it's obviously why we've got more trams on order, you know, to get that extra capacity into the system. Park and ride is part of that, going back to obviously what Doreen was saying before. Maybe we haven't focused on it because in many ways park and ride might not be for people who live here. It's not so much for our own residents. But the point is the lack of a facility for it starts to damage the services for our residents. So, you know, if you had a north, south, east, west park and ride offer off the M60, it possibly would be more for people who don't live here. But in the end, that will benefit our residents if we were to provide that, because then it would relieve pressure on other parts of the system. So, you know, I agree with you. We need to think more seriously about how we manage capacity across the different modes so that, you know, everyone's got a good service. I would like to see night running of Metrolink. Trains is obviously something we'd only be able to do once we got it under our control. But I agree with you. I go back to that 24/7 city point about running what people would expect from a city at our level. Now, I can hear almost people, the TfGM side of the table, oh, how are we going to afford that? Another thing. Let's trial it maybe. You know, I know the nighttime economy advisor, Sasha Lord, wants to see it. I know the Greater Manchester Police very much want to see it because they think it would help with management of the city centre, particularly at 3, 4. You know, I'm looking around and saying, well, most of us grew up in an era where you go to bed about 1 o'clock, but obviously for anyone with teenage kids, they know that that's when they go out now, and it's obviously 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock when they're coming home. You know, we need to create a public transport system that also creates public safety and, you know, manages the city centre well. So I agree with you. The question is, can we afford it? Could it be done? You know, could you run 1 or 2 Metrolinks through the night to give people, because as you rightly say, it's not just party goers, it's people on shifts, isn't it? And giving them a public transport offer that perhaps they haven't got at the moment. I think we should look at these things and see if they can be financed, because I think it's all about the way the city is developing, and it's what people will expect if they come to live here.
Okay, thanks for that. Neil?
Thanks, Chair. I'll try to be as brief as possible, bearing in mind the time constraints we've got today. Can I thank Andy for coming today? And certainly I think we'd all welcome the vast majority of what's in this report. I think there's some excellent things. But you did mention the Northern Gateway, Andy, and I am a little bit worried that we may not possibly have the public transport infrastructure to serve the Northern Gateway. And I'm pleased that you mentioned things like, for example, park and ride at the Northern Gateway. But one of the problems that I do see, we have to remember that the Northern Gateway is going to be very, very close to one of the worst congestion points in the conurbation around Simister Island, where you've got 3 motorways converging. And yet, one of the proposals is to put another motorway junction at Birch, presumably using the current slip roads that are used for Birch services. And it has been alluded that, again, we possibly, that's almost saying to people, but we want people to use cars as well. And I have to say that people do already use Birch services as a junction illegally and do actually travel through then residential areas, causing more congestion, simply to try and avoid the queues that are forming going towards Simister Island. People use them as shortcuts. They either come off the M60 at Heaton Park or they will use illegally Birch services. So I'm just wondering, I do think that we need to have to look at possibly better public transport infrastructure around the Northern Gateway. There is actually a railway line that runs adjacent to the Northern Gateway. It's currently in the ownership of the East Lancashire Railway, steam enthusiasts, but I'm just wondering if it's possible that some kind of arrangement or agreement can be got with ELR in order to put more commercial services on to serve the Northern Gateway.
Well, thanks, Neil. I strongly agree with you. I think there needs to be, if any of these large-scale developments are to go ahead, as we hope they will, there needs to be a clear new public transport offer to support them. I'm really clear about that. So I take on board everything that you're saying, and the same is true of the Logistics North point that was made before. We should never be building, I don't think, new development, be they homes, factories, offices, that are pretty much built for the car. You know, we need to have that mentality that we're always giving people alternatives. So I don't know whether, Simon, on this one again, you want to say something. Neil, what I would say is through consultation, this is probably if it needs to be further developed to give communities more confidence that there's a proper public transport offer, then I think that through consultation on the spatial framework and the accompanying transport statements, we need to get more clarity for people on these questions.
I think it's probably worth stressing there's an awful lot of very good strategic planning that's taking place across the two councils in Northern Gateway at the moment, and they've drawn ourselves into that extensively, and there are a number of concepts that are being looked at, including the potential role of links principally actually over the motorway, because one of the key issues for Northern Gateway is making sure that there's sufficient access from the south into the Northern Gateway area, which could well be public transport led, could well be in the early days in particular bus led, and the road links around Birch could be one of the options in terms of that. So I think there's an awful long way to go in terms of firming up the specifics, but Northern Gateway is clearly a very exciting opportunity in terms of the level of economic growth that it could deliver in the north of the conurbation. So we recognise that it's a real strategic planning priority for ourselves, and as I say, there's the basis of a very good activity underway with the two councils around that, including looking at whether at any point in the future that Haywood line could play a role.
Okay, I've got Eunice.
Hello, Andy. As you know, I'm speaking from the Wigan side, and when you get to Wigan, we're very limited within the type of public transport we can use. But Wigan just doesn't stop where it shows Wigan on the map. It goes a lot further west than where Wigan is. Now, the Vantage service has really, it's boosted people getting out of the cars, using the East Lancs, coming in. It's at capacity now, even with the extra buses on in the morning. Can the whatever the Vantage service be pushed further down the East Lancs Road, because then it will pick up a lot more, because we've got it onto the Lee side, but the other side of the Wigan Borough seems to be lacking on it. We've got the East Lancs, which can take you straight down there, and hopefully that will make it that people can get into Manchester a lot easier, because it's at capacity now, so it's obviously working. People want to use it, so therefore can we do that and look at pushing it in, because they're looking at the HS2 at the moment, which will be coming in, or probably going through Goulburn and that way. So if we can push it as further down the East Lancs as we can, which will be really good, because we've got the new Stone Cross, we've got all the development there. If it could make a circle round there and come back out onto the East Lancs Road, you know, just to extend it, because I'm not asking for a railway, and I know the funding wouldn't be there, but I think if we could expand the Vantage service, that would be a benefit to the other side of Wigan.
You're preaching to the converted here, Eunice. Obviously, I know the challenges of transporting Wigan very well. I think there was some thinking about whether or not Vantage could run as an East Lancs service rather than going off on the guided section, whether there could be an East Lancs only option. And I think that would make a lot of sense to pick up the issues I was talking about before in response to James. I think we do need to have a look at the borough in terms of its connectivity. Bryn near you, Bryn Station, I think we've got stations like that where we need to boost the parking capacity to get more people to use it. Hindley will be another example of that. You know, we've got good assets in the borough, but we're not making the most of them at the moment. And I'm, as you know, I'm very sympathetic to seeing how we can do that. I think the public transport, I mean, Bolton might have a claim for this, but I think Wigan could legitimately say it's some way behind some of our other boroughs in terms of access to public transport. Too many people living in Wigan, and I include myself in this, really have no option but the car if they're wanting to come into city centre Manchester. And until you solve that, you're not going to solve the congestion on the East Lancs, the M62, M50, all of M61, all of the problems that come from that. So yeah, I'm in sympathy with you, and I think that is very much in the thinking around Vantage-style services expanded elsewhere.
Thanks.
Okay, thanks for that. David?
Thank you, Andy, for championing the cause of Greater Manchester Conurbation in relation to rail service or poor rail service. I would like to request that there are two very important pieces of infrastructure which would greatly help trains within the conurbation. One is the link between Lostock and Wigan, because that gives the facility to deviate any electric services through Westhorn, Hindley, into Wigan that way, rather than if you have a blockade north of Lostock. That's been on the back burner now for some considerable time, and every time we ask about it, it's coming, it's coming, it's coming. On the second piece of infrastructure is the Northern Hub. I'm getting a bit, I love the fact that we are opening out the access to the airport from Yorkshire in that way, but the problem is we've now created another pinch point where we ought to have by now done Northern Hub, which has got extra platforms in Piccadilly, which could then service the trains that are having to continually queue outside Deansgate from Liverpool and from Preston and Bolton through that area. So can we push that through central government?
No, thank you, David. I'm going to, again, get Simon to come back on the Lostock point, which I think is accepted. It's a case, again, of it being prioritised for funding. The Northern Hub is a crucial point, because if you look back at what happened last year, you could argue a lot about who caused it and who was to blame. The root cause, in my view, was creating a new timetable using the Ordsall Cord without the full Northern Hub investment at Oxford Road, Piccadilly. That, in the end, is the problem. You've got a timetable here that assumed there would be all of that capacity, when in fact it wasn't done. That is basically what has happened. So it's pushing 15 trains an hour through central Manchester, and you're basically dicing all it, because there's just you've no slack in that system. So you are absolutely right. I'm not sure I said this earlier to the committee, but I met the Secretary of State for Transport earlier this week. We had a good discussion about that. Network Rail have got an expedited piece of work underway looking at central Manchester capacity, short, medium, long term, what's needed. My experience of this is, unbelievably, they got they'd made assumptions that have completely not proven to be true. They downgraded all of that stuff 18 months, a year ago. If you remember, they cancelled some of that work, well, postponed it. And I think they've had the shock of their lives, really, when the reality has hit. And I think it's a rail system that works in these little, they work on projects without seeing the bigger picture. And I think that's part of what's got to change in the industry. But the Northern Hub is very much back on the agenda.
Okay, Howard?
I'll be as brief as I can. Thanks, Andy, for coming. A couple of things I just want to talk about specific in terms of Oldham and in terms of the Eastern End, in terms of Sean Crompton. So I welcome you what you're saying about not building for car use, however, what's proposed in the GMSF. And also, I'd echo and share concerns of my colleague in terms of the Northern Gateway, and plus the other developments that are not in Oldham or over the boundary. I don't see any alternative to people but to do it by car, because there isn't any other way of doing it. And I'm just, I'm conscious, I'd agree with the words, but in terms of what's in the document, there isn't anything about that. I notice it flags up if you look at the first map, map 1, says Metrolink capacity improvement, Sean Crompton. Well, it'd be remiss of me not to mention, and you mentioned it in your own remarks, the zoning, which actually puts this station, making it cheaper to visit Rochdale than to visit Oldham, which has got to be, in my book, fundamentally wrong. But it talks about capacity improvement, so I had the joy of using that service this morning. I would now say passenger levels are equivalent to what I'd regard as on the Victoria line or the Circle line peak tube in terms of standing like cattle in trucks. And people deciding not to get on a tram because they just don't want that amount of lack of personal space. So there's an issue about capacity of physically of the trams. The other issue, which for me is an issue I've been raising for quite a while, and I just think we need to grasp, and it's not that expensive, is in terms of you get somebody like me, like Dorian, out of my car, but then I need to park my car. And I regularly, as do other people from Milnrow, go Sean Crompton full, Durker full, Mumps full, on it, and then you just think, do you know what, I might as well drive into Manchester, even though it's more expensive and it takes me longer because I haven't got anywhere to park. So doing something about APNR and making sure that people using our Metrolink car parks and other park and rides, which again, I welcome them comments you've made, is used by the people who are using the public transport, not just used by somebody who is using it for free parking for the day. I just think it's long overdue, and we need to do something about that. Again, if you come from that sort of that end of our of the Greater Manchester conurbation, you know, it says Trans-Pennine route upgraded to Leeds, which is great unless you try and use Greenfield Station, which has got appalling disabled access and has actually got, and I don't need to tell you that because I know Debbie's chewed your ear off about it, has got a worse service and is the only station we've got in the borough. We've got one just across the boundary at Mills Hill, but it's the only one, so that's not an option, and you're forcing more people, and car ownership's higher in that part of the world than anywhere else in our borough, that's not an option for them anymore, and we're forcing people into the cars. The thing I do welcome, I think, and we're still waiting on Metrolink to deliver its promise of a direct link to Piccadilly and mainline stations, which is what we were originally promised about 20 or 30 years ago, is the issue about people, second person on trams. I'd welcome conductors or a second person, however you want to do it, because I think that would, I know my colleagues here from Rochdale, sorry he's gone, I've raised this before, there is continuing concerns, and I know we put a lot of effort into it in terms of getting it right, but eventually that scheme we're currently doing will end, and I don't see, well, I don't see why there isn't a business case to be made that actually having conductors on, particularly on that Oldham, Rochdale-Oldham thing, would tackle the massive fare evasion that takes place on that line far more than anywhere else in the network. Will then also deliver safety for people. So, and if you just turn over the page, the last bit, which again I suppose I welcome on map 2, is the proposed new station at Cop Road. I have, because I'm a nerd, still got all the correspondence about why you couldn't possibly have put an extra stop between Mumps and Rochdale about the impact it would have on running times, and the world would stop spinning and hell would freeze over.
and I exaggerate not from colleagues sat there, and I shall be enjoying digging those out when you justify how it won't affect running times. But do you know what? I welcome it, and it's got my support, but I just find it's quite interesting that very quickly we can just turn the metric round and all of a sudden it's doable and workable, and it's the right place to put it with all them properties you're going to build there. Don't have a problem with that, but it is very interesting when people have been banging on about other places that the reason is it's just no, we're not doing it, and that'd be the honest answer rather than no, you know, the timetable will go to hell and an handcart, which it clearly won't, because you've clearly costed that and it'll work and it'll be welcome. So I think what I'm saying is I welcome, you know, the words is fine. I'm just saying, and that's good. But when you look at the detail in this, in terms of the part of Oldham that I represent, but also in terms of it, I don't see anything that helps us be more connected and less reliant on a car than there is now. And we're actually going to build a load more stuff that's going to put more people onto the roads and pile them onto that excellent car park called the M62 that soon turns into the M60. Regular as clockwork at junction 21, whether you're either going east or west these days, and we need to do something about that. Thanks, Chair.
Okay, thanks, Howard. I don't know whether, again, Simon wants to pick up any of the points. The bits I'll just talk about are capacity. I mean, you're absolutely right. You know, we have to manage capacity. Again, that's why we're bringing the new trams, Howard. In terms of people on trams, in an ideal world, I'd like to have a conductor or a guard on every tram. I mean, the impossibility we've got is funding that at the moment. Now, I think we do need to do a piece of work maybe on revenue protection and whether or not there's more we can do in that, and that might help us provide more. We have a lot of travel safe officers, PCSOs funded by the new contract with the Metrolink operator. The question is, could we go further? The big point I want to pick up that you've made is about this point about people going to Metrolinks and the car park's full and the next one's full and you may as well carry on. I have said to the team, I want to see expanded parking capacity, as I said before, at existing stops, and, you know, not costly things, but just tiers, you know, where you put in the tiered car parks. And I think if you look in the 5-year plan, there's quite a few of those type of schemes in there. I've also said to Kate, more from the information point of view, could we have a system where in the morning people could have a real-time access to how many spaces there are available at TfGM car parks, you know, so that people can not drive in vain, but go knowing that there's X many places available. And now, okay, that's a bit complicated, but if that's the level of quality we need to build into our system if we're to make all of this work. On the big point about the spatial framework and the transport linked to the big developments, which you said, there's going to be no further major rewrite. Let me just make that clear. You know, we have substantially revised the spatial framework, and we are consulting on it again. Not that there's then going to be another major change. That there's now going to, but it's a genuine consultation, and I want to give you a commitment today that, you know, if you want to meet with other colleagues and talk about these big schemes and whether we've fully got the transport solution that they need, I'm more than happy to sit down and have those conversations, because those big schemes will only have confidence if you can say to people that the public transport side of things has been properly thought through. So I think that's what this consultation really needs to focus on. Let's not get into the, well, people will have to decide how they want to play it, but I think we'll spend our time more productively if we're getting into the actual detail of some of these schemes, how they're going to work, and then having a debate about how we might improve the supporting transport options.
Okay, last but definitely not least, Annette.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the patience. Thank you for I cannot thank everybody who's done all the work on this document. It must have taken a long time, so well done. I'd just like to follow on from Councillor Gribben. I'm a Marple resident, and I've been on a mission since I came onto this committee to get some kind of connection between Stockport and Marple. Sadly, it's not in here. There's nothing specifically. I welcome the movement on the tram train, the development, and it's obviously there's things happening. But I would call to question tram train Marple to Manchester. as opposed to looking specifically at Marple to Stockport. This is because it's a very expensive business getting Marple into Manchester, because you're going to go off away from the railway line and go into Piccadilly Gardens, wherever, as opposed to, and what gain? I know Councillor Grimm referred to the fact we own 2 carriages. Well, we do actually have a marvellous service from Marple to Manchester, generally, when they're not on strike and various things. My daughter might disagree slightly, she uses it every day. But, you know, it is a very efficient service, and we already have it. But what we don't have is an efficient service from Marple to Stockport of any description. There's congestion through Bredbury, congestion through Offerton. Every morning, we're nearly, it's interesting that Dan Bank, we're actually at 35 or something, we're nearly exceeding the NO2 levels in Marple because of the congestion on the roads. We're not going to get the A6 to M60 link anytime soon. I don't know what's more effective, what's more cost effective, but I certainly think we should be looking at Marple to Stockport, some kind of fixed rail link or a tram train link, rather than focusing totally on this Marple to Manchester line. Thank you.
Thanks, Annette. I'm going to pass the Stockport Marple question to Simon, but I'm going to pick up on your first point because it's a good opportunity, I think, to say to the team in front of everybody, they have, as you can see, worked really hard. You know, a lot of thought has gone into this. You know, it was to a tight timetable and a challenge to do it all in the very start of the year. The reason we did that, though, was because we wanted to start the year with confidence, you know, to make a clear statement about the city region at a time of national uncertainty, knows where it's going, it knows what it wants to do, because the more we project that confidence, the stronger our case in winning resources from the government to pay for it from other investors. So, I mean, the team have worked incredibly hard on it all. I think they would be, and I would be the first to acknowledge that it can be improved further still, and it will be improved through detailed discussions with you all. But I'm glad that you said that. And Simon, would you pick up the Marple Stockport issue?
Thank you, and thanks for the comments. And I just get to put my name on the front of it. Actually, Nicola, who's here, did most of the hard work in terms of coordinating all of the activity around the plan. And yes, it's absolutely out for consultation, so that ultimately the final plan that we publish in the summer is the right plan. We're acutely aware that we need to keep working with Stockport in terms of improving the performance of public transport alternatives between Marple and Stockport. The challenges around what scale of public transport link between the two places can we make a coherent investment case for? And so far as yet, we've struggled to be able to pull together what might look like the start of an investable business case for any kind of fixed track link between the two places. But what we can do is develop a much better overall public transport plan out of Marple. And Marple to Manchester tram train actually forms part of that component. By being able to continue to increase the performance of the rail system out of Marple, we can then address some of the car traffic that's coming out of Marple at the moment, and we can look at how we can use the highway system better over time to improve public transport links between the two places. And what I think would be useful before we finalise the plan is if we spend some time with you, Councillor Finney, just working you through the options that we've looked at in that regard, so you've got a clearer sense of the range of different options that we've been looking at.
Okay, thank you very much. A special thank you to Andy, well, for putting his next meeting off just a little bit, realistically, because nearly 2 hours he's been here listening to everybody's views, and I think that's absolutely fantastic in a way. I wanted to make sure, and he expressed that view, that he wanted to make sure that he listened to everybody on this committee who had a view, so we can take those views forward. And thank you very much. We'll not ask you to wait for the next listing on our paperwork. Well, thank you very much, and you get yourself off to your next meeting. Thank you. See you soon. Thanks. So, moving swiftly back onto item 6. Bob?
Thanks, Chair. I'll make this very brief. This is a part of the regular update on the RCIS programme, We've been in discussion with Network Rail about how we can best spend the limited funds we have. One of those is around the application of tactile strips for the visually impaired. The solution that they prefer us to use doesn't demonstrate value for money. We were looking to use small amounts of stick-on type relief so that people could feel it. They're saying no, they want to renew all of the coping stones along the edge, which is a lot greater cost. So that doesn't help us to spread that money around. So we've taken that out of the scope, and subject to your approval, we will reallocate that to other reserve items on the list. Also to note that at Hyde Central, because of the increase in footfall, that now qualifies for CCTV. So we're going to use some of that funding to go onto that one. Happy to take questions.
Okay. Howard?
Chair, yeah, conscious of the time and everything, but there's two different things here. We haven't managed to negotiate a thing about tactile strips, which we obviously thought were a really good idea, and they are, and we spend a fortune, and rightly so, making sure, you know, Metrolink network, pelican crossings, puffin crossings, whatever you call them, it's all there, but yet on stations, maybe not, which delivers a message to people who rely on them sort of things, doesn't it? And that's, I presume, why we thought it were a good idea. And I'd have thought sticking something down would have been very sensible rather than somebody trying to get us to pay to renew their stations, which is what it sounds like to me. But I'm not so sure that means we should remove this from being one of our aspirations, that we haven't managed to get a deal. Otherwise, we're delivering a message and just saying, you know, until we rebuild any of these stations, and most of us won't be in this room or even on this planet then, there isn't going to be anything done on the tactile side of it. So I'm just trying to work out what, you know, we all spend a lot of time and money and effort. They're very valuable, these things, by people who are partially sighted, and it's part of making our transport system accessible. But by taking them out of our sort of aspirations, I'm not so sure we should do that. And I'm just trying to look for some sort of explanation about, I can understand why we haven't made it to an agreement. You might want to allocate the money, but I'm not so sure we should abandon the aspiration, really.
I think it's fair to say that if we hadn't have raised it, then they are not on the list of items that Network Rail and the train operating companies would have done. If you remember through the case for change, for us to take operation of the GM stations, we thought this is our minimum standard. We should do this. So we were trying to position it that any funds we had, let's start to bring those in. Unfortunately, we weren't successful with that case for change. And looking back now, we've tried to negotiate some of those items through with Network Rail, but they're quite adamant that they want concrete, not stick-on. And it just isn't good value for money.
Thank you, Chair. 2 points. First of all, how do we define high crime locations? What stats are actually used to decide that? And secondly, in relation to the appendix, some work has already been done at stations that have much lower footfall than other stations where it's considered to be a low priority. I just wondered whether there was what the logic was behind some of the work being done, but then stations that are busier not necessarily being considered to be a priority.
It was just about the help points. My experience of using help points in other areas of the country has not been very good in terms of reliability, both of the information and of the machine. I just hope the ones that we're going to be installing are of higher quality. Thank you.
With regard to the ASB, they're taken from stats produced either by British Transport Police Network Rail and more recently by TfGM and the Travel Safe Partnership. So we now allocate resource not specifically BTP's resource, but allocate our resource based on demand, whereas before it was just a general patrol. We look where the hotspots are, we target it now. With regards to the appendix, the reason some of those may have been delivered at lower footfall is that the categories changed over since 2006. So what may have been appropriate for that stop at that time, we still include it as a part of the programme to show that it's been developed. And with regard to the help points, we will always insist that Network Rail do something that's of a good quality and a good standard. So they, more often than not, are the asset owner, but it's passed to the train operating company to maintain it and to operate it. So it goes back to their control, not Network Rail's control.
Okay, so I just want to make it clear, we're here to approve the removal of tactile strips, to agree the removal of the strips in Tranche 6 scope, and to approve the installation of customer information screens at Hyde Central Station, and 3, to approve the relocation of funding for the installation of the RSIS scopes at Tranche 6 reserve stations. Everybody in agreement of that? Thank you very much. So last, we've got item 8, register of key decisions. That's just for noting. So everybody okay with that? Okay, did you want? Okay, smashing. Thank you very much. Please have a safe journey home.
Before we go, can I just please clarify the question that I was asking when the Mayor was here, and it was about this committee doing what it can to lobby government in terms of investment and control and responsibility for infrastructure. So can we think about writing a letter to the appropriate minister backing up the ambitions and the aspirations of the 2040 plan, and making the point that we need the appropriate investment and control over infrastructure and services to do that?
The answer to that is yes, but what we'll make sure is you get the details of what's already been done, so you understand, because I know that's already been lobbied, etc.
From this committee, though?
Yes. Yeah. Okay.